Hello, guys. Welcome back to the Free Rider podcast. I am the host of today's episode. I'm joined, as always, by Brenden and Oliver.
Hello.
Hello.
Before we get started, I want to let you guys know that we are recording in the basement of the CRC dorm. So if you hear any screams outside, that'll be the kids playing pool. So the topic of today's episode is congressional term limits, which is connected specifically to week 7 of our course when we discuss the US Congress. So those of you listening likely already are familiar with the concept of term limits. They're essentially rules for incumbent politicians about the maximum limit of how many terms they can serve in political office. For example, the president can serve a maximum of 2 4-year terms for a combined 8 years. So Oliver, Brenden, do you guys know what the term limits are for Congress people?
So, from my understanding, the Senate has 6 years, and then the House of Representatives has 2 years.
And the Senate 6 years are staggered so that not every senator is up for re-election at any given midterm election.
Right, yes, that's exactly right. So to summarize, House representatives serve 2-year terms and are up for re-election every even year. Senators serve 6-year terms, and the Senate has staggered elections, as Brenden mentioned. So 1/3 of the senators are up for re-election every other year. This means that in a 6-year cycle, every senator will be up for re-election. However, Congress doesn't have a federal term limit like the presidency, so Congress people can theoretically keep getting re-elected essentially until they die. So that's the topic of that we're focusing on today. What does this lack of congressional term limits mean for American democracy? And how would America look if we had congressional term limits?
So, I would say that it is a tricky situation because a lot of times people vote because, they vote for the senator or the House representative because of how well known they are, and so the term limit doesn't necessarily matter. But I feel like actually if the term limits aren't there and they're abolished, it might be able to get more people out to vote, since there is now more chances of other people to go against the incumbent representative.
Yeah, I think that a lot of arguments in favor of term limits talk about just people amassing too much power. I think especially when you have House elections, smaller districts, and you have the same congressperson serving there for decades and decades, then there's a lack of accountability if they're pretty sure that they're going to win the next election, because there's no real challengers. And I think that more accountability would come from imposing term limits. But at the same time, I think on the other element that theoretically a congressperson could be voted out at any moment. So it is just up to the people to determine if a congressperson doesn't deserve to. So I think in an ideal democracy, maybe it wouldn't matter. But in our democracy, where especially for local elections, turnout is less than ideal, as a protection from individuals amassing too much power, I think that term limits are a possible remedy for that.
Okay. Well, I think that actually one of the main arguments against imposing term limits on Congress people is that it would significantly raise the information costs of voters in America. As we know, voters are already pretty uninformed on a lot of issues, and to not allow incumbent famous politicians to run after a certain number of terms would make it even more difficult for voters sort of to keep up to date with all the potential new candidates. So what do you guys think of that point and how it might affect American democracy on that front?
I think that's interesting when you talk about information barriers. I think for me, that becomes an issue not with term limits, but just with elections and how we make information available and how we actually approach elections in this country. So if, again, there's an idealized version and there's an actual version of elections. The other thing I think I'm thinking about is the idea, I talked about having accountability, but I think with accountability, there also is the idea that maybe if someone isn't constantly pitching for re-election, maybe they will actually act more honestly and justly in accordance with their own values and what they think is right for the country, if they're not constantly trying to appease their constituents or win elections. So maybe if you have someone who's a career congressperson who's been doing this for a long time, and if they do accurately represent the interests of their constituents and they are just working towards what they think is best, that could necessarily that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, I actually definitely agree with Brenden on that last point. There are many, and it could go both ways, I guess you can say. There are many representatives that you could think, oh, you don't want term limits because they do such a good job and they are actually representing the population. But at the same time, there could be representatives that just keep winning the elections but do not represent, and they do more of a selfish job, but that they only care about their campaign and how much power they have in Congress. So I guess in that case, it can go both ways. So maybe a term limit might be more of a balanced idea to take away the negatives instead of just having no term limits and looking for positives through other representatives.
Indeed. In many ways, I think term limits, sort of whether or not there are term limits, sort of determines the overall, perhaps culture is the best word, of the legislature, right? Because if we did impose term limits on Congress people, there might be younger politicians that are able to come in that perhaps would be more in touch with some of the younger voters, which of course would create a more dynamic legislature and possibly a more progressive legislature. But on the other hand, having career politicians, as Brenden mentioned a little bit earlier, that have the experience of being in office for many years and the I guess a grasp of traditional American political culture is going to create a very different overall culture within the legislature. How do you guys think that these two different congresses would affect the way that American political culture is shaped?
Well, I think what you said about term limits leading to younger politicians, I think is right, and I would also add that it just would decrease the barrier for not even just younger politicians, but people who just haven't held office before to become a politician. It would make it easier for an aspiring politician to become someone who holds office, because obviously when you have been holding a seat for several elections, you amass a certain amount of credibility, name brand recognition, trust with your constituents that it can be hard to break against. You always talk about incumbents have a natural electoral advantage because people know who they are, and it's always people like the familiar. It's always easier to stay the same than to have a radical change, but perhaps wouldn't be a bad thing to make it easier for people to break in to the political scene. But that also, at the same point, it could also lead to people holding office that maybe aren't qualified or don't have, like you said, the experience. So it's a two-edged sword, and maybe there's a balance to be found where there are term limits, but not to the extent of the president. Maybe it's 6 years, 10 years, something, 2 terms, something like that would allow for more younger voices and newer politicians, but also still reward people for building trust and coalitions among their constituents.
Yeah, I would agree with there has to be a balance because experience in any career is very important. It's essential to have experience, you've been there, you've been years working with others, collaborating and making sure that you can pass the right laws to help the nation. So if it was just a quick term, kind of like the president, I feel like for Congress, the president's 8 years is a little too little for them to create this trust throughout the whole branch and with other groups like the lobby groups and all that. So I think if there could be a balance between how much time, not too much time, kind of like a Goldilocks time frame of how long they can go, and then allowing other progressive younger candidates to bring around the young people and become just more progressive throughout the whole branch.
Yeah, and how do you guys think that, imposing term limits on Congress people is going to affect perhaps American political stability? Because as we know, there's a lot of Congress people that have, sort of, it feels like they've sort of been there forever, like Mitch McConnell or Chuck Schumer. But in a way, having those people that are always there has kind of creates a Congress in which you're not going to have radical changes every half a decade or so, and it sort of creates a little bit of political and legislative stability. So do you think that getting rid of imposing the term limits is going to undermine political stability in any way?
I would say that in 2022, I don't know how much political stability still exists. If I'm being frank, I think that there's been a major assault on democratic principles that we're seeing, and unprecedented levels of vitriol and division in politics. So I don't know if stability insofar as having the same people for a number of terms would necessarily, if it would be that much worse if we allowed term limits and had new people come in, because frankly I don't see how it could get that much worse than how it is right now. So I think, yeah, I think that with the newer people there will be the same divisions that exist outside of the electoral process. And so it'll always just reflect the political divisions in our country at any given moment, because the people elect the people they want to represent them. So if people are divided, then the representatives will be divided. I don't know if that stability so much comes from having the same people, if it would change if we had just different people that still represented the same interests or the same beliefs,
Yeah, I think also it might be necessary for the state we are in now as a country to have these radical changes,
right?
Instead of having such quote unquote stability, which I don't really think that we have. So, and hopefully these radical changes obviously are in a positive way for the country.
Right.
But I think that sometimes it's good to have like a fresh new group of hungry politicians that want to make a change in the country, and maybe term limits might actually cause that to happen.
And the final question is the same as the final question from episode 1. Do you guys think that we will see congressional term limits come into fruition in the near future or in our lifetimes?
I don't think so. I don't think politicians would want to give that up. Representatives give that up for themselves.
Yeah, I was going to say, look at the people who would have to pass that law if that were to be the case, and they're people who probably want to hold on to their power. So unless, kind of like what I said in the last episode, unless there is a massive shift in how laws and like amendments get passed, I don't see that happening with the current crop. I mean,
yeah, they might agree with this whole democratic idea of not or of having term limits, but of course they just don't want to give up.
You just got to think, if you see politicians as strategic actors who will always want to maintain their power, then if you're looking at it from that point of view, then probably not.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, that is the end of the episode for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and listening.
Thank you for having us, Michael.
Thank you for having us, Michael.
Sure.
It's been a real pleasure.